Well, if one talks about a world of perpetual happiness, albeit gradients of well-being, uh, it helps if one does not suggest that what one is urging is revolutionary, even if it is revolutionary, and if one can draw on existing imagery and language, then it can seem less alien to people. Because after all, what is the Christian conception of heaven all about? It is a perpetual sublime bliss. Now, as you probably gathered, I don't have any religious leanings, but simply because God doesn't or may not exist, let's phrase it diplomatically, doesn't mean to say that we can't aim to build an approximation of heaven. And so, yes, I will sometimes use terms like naturalisation of heaven or paradise engineering, combining notions of ideal life, paradise, with the stress, with something like the engineering to convey how this isn't going to happen by beautiful thoughts and noble deeds alone, that we're actually going to have to address the biological roots of suffering. Sabotage at the mill. This is back to the notion of the so-called hedonic treadmill, that if it is possible, as seems likely, we can use genetic engineering to calibrate the level of subjective well-being. We can recalibrate our set points so that they are far more exalted than was the case in the ancestral environment of adaptation back on the African savannah. It's worth asking, why do these extraordinarily nasty states such as depression, jealousy, anxiety exist? Essentially because they helped our genes lead more copies of themselves in the ancestral environment. In the case of depression or low mood, this is just one example, that it is adaptive for vulnerable naked apes to live in tribal groupings. Nonetheless, within the tribe, there are going to be alphas, betas, and deltas, and if a delta male were tempted to challenge the alpha male to sleep with his wife and do anything like that, the delta might get severely mauled, driven out of the tribe, which would be lethal. And it's been suggested by evolutionary biologists that depression is the internalized correlate of the losing subroutine. And if you look at depressive people, they tend to be cowed and submissive. It's associated with subordinate behavior. And one of the consequences in future, if we do decide we want to phase out depression and low mood, it will lead to a society probably of much more active citizens, which is turning one objection against a super happy world on its head. It's sometimes said that if we were all happy, we would be vulnerable to manipulation by the ruling elites. We would just be, lotus eaters, so to speak. But in practice, you're far more likely to get active citizens if you are naturally a happy, vibrant, unsubmissive person. Now, clearly there will be a different sociological dynamics if you don't have people who have internalized this subordinate depressive behavior. But yeah, the problems of a society in which everyone is invincibly happy are very different from problems of a society where many people suffer from low mood. And that was the example of the evolutionary origins of depression. I think the evolutionary origins of jealousy are perhaps more obvious, that anyone who was laid back about his neighbour sleeping with his wife, well, he wasn't the person who passed on his genes to the next generation. And though I mentioned earlier about the possibility of retaining the functional analogues of some of our nastier Darwinian emotions, like low mood or anxiety, I can't really see any any sense in retaining even the functional analogue of something like jealousy. I mean, why? What possible useful purpose does jealousy serve other than its tendency to promote the inclusive fitness of our genes? Good question. Contemplative bliss will certainly be an option in future. I wouldn't wish to suggest that we should all spend 18 hours a day being furiously productive. Doing what exactly? But it's worth dwelling on how there's a distinction between happiness and motivation, and that very crudely raw bliss, happiness, positive hedonic tone seems to be particularly associated with activation of the mu opioid receptors in our hedonic hotspots, whereas motivation is associated with high mesolimbic dopamine function. And as can be shown experimentally today, but in future sustainably, it will be possible to arbitrarily increase or diminish pleasure and or motivation on these axes. Empirically today, one knows that the happiest people statistically will tend also to be the most motivated. It's depressives who tend to suffer from learned helplessness and behavioural despair. So other things being equal, raising people's hedonic set point, it extends both the range of stimuli they find rewarding and also the depth of their motivation. So rather than living in a stagnant society in which people don't want to do anything, other things being equal, a society in which people are naturally super happy, they will frequently want to seek out new and variegated stimuli, and this makes getting stuck in a rut less likely for the individual and also for civilization as a whole, other things being equal. In terms of what one can do now to alleviate the burden of suffering in the world, what is the greatest source of severe, chronic and readily avoidable suffering in the world today? It's entirely man-made, and that is factory farming and the death factories. And though one can, and I do, explore various high-tech solutions, such as the development of in vitro meat, cultured meat, which will probably be coming, it will be commercialized later this century. I think anyone who is at all morally serious has an obligation to become a vegan now. In the case of something like child abuse, for instance, if someone says, "But I like the taste," we wouldn't consider this ethically acceptable. But if someone says, "But I like the taste when it comes to eating meat," we somehow regard this as, yes, I said, it is a matter of personal choice. But if one accepts, and I think all the neurological, genetic, behavioral evidence converges on this, that a pig, for instance, is as sentient as a pre-linguistic toddler, then it is profoundly immoral to treat other sentient beings in the way we do. And not merely should, I think, one give up eating meat and animal products oneself, one should try to persuade others to do so. It's not a matter of personal choice any more than child abuse or rape should be a matter of personal choice. And I suspect future generations in society may well define our era in terms of the way we treated sentient beings of other species, in the same way now as we define the Nazi era in terms of the Holocaust. And I'm aware this is quite strong language, but I'm using this quite carefully and not with any intent of being sensationalist. And one has to consider the possibility of simply rationalizing self-interest. It does not require heroic self-sacrifice to give up meat and animal products. It does require a modicum of inconvenience, and if one is going to be a vegan as distinct from vegetarian, it's certainly worth reading a book or two on nutrition. In terms of protein, one can get an arbitrarily high level of protein on a vegan diet. There are vegan weightlifters, as you probably gathered. I'm not one of them. Some people actually do better on a low protein diet. They feel less anxious and tense. Other people actually prefer a high protein diet, but it doesn't involve choosing between the two. I mean, if you're really fanatical about getting maximum protein, you can eat protein isolate and get far more protein than even the most avid carnivore will. This is essentially a non-issue. Protein isolate, something like 90% pure pea protein or something like that. However, I would stress that if you do adopt a cruelty-free vegan lifestyle, you won't need to consume all these pills and potions, but this is simply addressed to the protein junkie who is convinced that he, and it generally is a he, can only flourish with prodigious amounts of protein. It would be nice if one could report that today there are wonder drugs one could take that would radically enrich one's subjective quality of life. Unfortunately, a reliable wonder drug that does this for everyone doesn't yet exist. It's a matter of stopgaps. The problems of recreational street drugs are well known. In many cases, they will provide an extremely rewarding experience in the short term, followed by some form of hangover. In any case, they just tend to kick into gear the negative feedback mechanisms of the brain, so that the good effects one experienced from the drug at the time, one gets this perhaps long drawn out withdrawal reaction the next day, or sometimes much longer. In the case of today's clinically licensed psychopharmaceuticals, once again, a very mixed bunch. Some people can do well on them. More commonly, people get a partial response, and other people simply don't respond at all. I'm thinking of the different classes of antidepressants, anti-anxiety agents. Probably the first thing to do, though, before exploring the pharmacological options, is to run through a checklist of all the boring stuff, ensuring optimal nutrition, good sleep discipline, daily aerobic exercise. Not especially exciting, but will contribute to long-term well-being. I'm assuming that any ethically serious person who considers the issues will at the very least become vegetarian, and I think in even the medium term, vegan. So this does mean cutting out meat and animal products. One can lead. It's probably best thing to do is rather than thinking of it as being a terrible loss, is to buy a few vegan recipe books. I confess I'm one of these people who takes a rather functional approach to diet. Normally I'm just concerned in getting optimal vitamins, minerals, nutrients and so on, but there are other vegans who lead a gourmet lifestyle and get tremendous pleasure out of food and cooking. And yeah, I would recommend buying a couple of vegan recipe books rather than listen to my home tips. Brave New World. This is a reaction many people will have to the prospect of phasing out suffering. Isn't this just a Brave New World? Recall how in Brave New World the proles, the epsilons were kept in their place doing menial jobs by Soma. It was a very stratified society, and the kind of pleasure that was enjoyed, Soma yielded. It was rather like Soma, if you recall, something like heroin, but without many of the more unfortunate side effects. And Brave New World is a very stagnant society too. But some kind of Brave New World is only one option amongst many. And to give one example, if we were to phase out the molecular substrates of experience below hedonic zero, it will be possible to explore radically altered states of consciousness, radically alien mind spaces. Today, I think it is probably irresponsible to urge anyone to take major psychedelics because of the risk of bad trips. But if we do phase out suffering, instead of this being a recipe for intellectual stagnation, it will be possible to explore modes of consciousness that today are simply physiologically inaccessible, certainly in any normal state of mind. Many rationalists in the transhuman community, when they think of their cognitive limitations, will be worried about deficiencies of inference and their inadequacies as good Bayesian reasoners or whatnot, whereas I think by far our most profound form of cognitive deficit is our lack of access to radically altered states of consciousness, as different as, let's say, waking and dreaming consciousness. And if one is drug naive, one has simply no notion really of what these radically altered states are like. Consider, for instance, imagine a community of congenitally blind people, and one member of the tribe takes this drug that yields visual experience. It clearly can't create a visual apparatus of nothing but visual experience, and the tribe member is astonished and amazed. He hasn't language to communicate what he's discovered. Perhaps he babbles about the inexpressible or the mystical, and the elders of the tribe, the super rationalists, are rather unimpressed. This radically altered state doesn't seem to confer reasoning abilities or greater sensory discrimination, and so they write off the babblings of this drug-deluded fool. But actually it's the drug-deluded fool that has stumbled on a profound discovery, even though he or she can't possibly have glimpsed its implications. And likewise, I would say we are in a position analogous to this tribe of congenitally blind people. We don't even have privative words to actually describe the state spaces of consciousness that are lacking. And it's not that, as we do explore the subjective properties of matter and energy that have not currently been recruited for any information signaling purposes, it's not as though we will be stumbling instantly on profound truths. On the contrary, we will be at first intellectually completely out of our depth. But nonetheless, as with undergoing visual experience for the first time, eventually I think we are post-human superintelligence is going to navigate these alien state spaces of consciousness, and full spectrum superintelligence will entail fluency in multiple state spaces of consciousness. It's extremely problematic whether a classical digital computer can even be sentient, let alone explore altered states of consciousness. And perhaps I'm slightly atypical amongst transhumanists in that I don't think post-human successors are going to be machine, or rather non-biological machine intelligence. I think that post-human superintelligence will actually be our biological descendants, augmented by IT. Fortunately, I don't think there's going to be this kind of trade-off, because today the roots of heaven and hell lie deep within the limbic system, and these, crudely the pleasure centers, for instance, you get projections into the neocortex. And once we understand the basis of hedonic tone and how to arbitrarily enrich or diminish it, then it's possible to paint, crudely speaking, any radically alien state space we explore with a positive hedonic valence. That doesn't sound particularly enchanting. It just guarantees that however strange, outlandish the nature of the experience that is disclosed, it will be sublime. Whereas today, unfortunately, given the nature of psychedelics, that unless you make sure you take a euphoriant, there is always the possibility of a bad trip. Yeah, I mean, consider something like visual intelligence. What are the prerequisites for superior visual intelligence? Yes, one needs a very rich capacity for discrimination. Perhaps one should have, ideally, the capacity to create great works of, of art, but at the same time, one does need to have this subjective experience of color. And so imagine a posthuman superintelligence that had extraordinarily discriminative capacities that stretched way beyond that of humans. Perhaps it could even notionally be programmed, or in the case of if it's something functionally analogous to a neural net, a connectionist network trained up to produce artistic works that other humans would describe as aesthetically superb. But if there were no subjective experience, could that system be described as possessing visual intelligence, let alone visual superintelligence? Now, a behaviorist would say, well, what does it matter? But insofar as humans, for instance, want to experience profound aesthetic experiences, visual experiences, the actual quality of experience, qualia, as philosophers would say, is profoundly important. And there is simply no way, and how is this tying into rationality, what you may be asking? There is simply no way that someone who is congenitally blind can go on in virtue of his or her superior reasoning processes to infer what the subjective experience of vision, visual experience, landscape, sunsets, great works of art is like, purely on the basis of his or her capacity to churn out inferences. Having the raw experiences and relevant semantic primitives is critical. And I suspect posthumans are going to be hyper-rational in sense on the basis of sense modalities and experience modalities that haven't even been invented today. I mean, one could ask, what is it like to be a hyper-intelligent bat? Now, yes, in one sense, it will involve echolocation in the form that bats undergo today, but nonetheless, the conceptual scheme, the dominant conceptual scheme that emerges out of a hyper-intelligent bat, an intelligent bat civilization, would be, profoundly alien in many ways. And yes, from our perspective as humans who can't echolocate, let alone imagine what the conceptual scheme of an advanced civilization of echolocatory beings would be like, no amount of reasoning and logical inference can tell us what this would involve. So I think it's important both to enrich our capacity, our serial depth of thought, but also to expand our range of experiences so that we can have a conceptual scheme that extends way beyond, in terms of raw experience, anything that is accessible today. If it were the case that something like psychological hedonism or the pleasure principle were true, then it might be argued on simple grounds of means ends rationality that something like the hedonistic imperative was the case. And if a lot of the time what we are really doing is trying to enhance our own subjective well-being, and if rationality is defined in terms of ability to achieve one's goals in the most efficient way, then biological reward enhancements are dictated by means ends rationality alone, and not on the basis of any ethical principle. But of course, psychological hedonism and its variants is quite controversial. Many people would deny that they are in any way motivated simply by the pursuit of their own well-being. If one looks at the historical track record of attempts at utopia, time and again things can go horribly wrong, and therefore if one does take seriously the idea that we have got this ethical obligation to phase out suffering, what could go wrong? A rather facile and simplistic answer, but I'm still going to give it first of all, is that if one does phase out the biological substrates of suffering, then the actual meaning of what it is to go wrong changes. That whereas in the case of environmental utopias, social utopias, in the past, if they have failed, they've frequently ended up causing more suffering. If we do actually change our biological architecture, then we can, in principle, make suffering impossible. So, although one can have the functional analogues of things going wrong, they won't go wrong in the same way as they did before. Nonetheless, there are other possible options to consider. One is that we would find ourselves trapped in a very suboptimal utopia, perhaps the functional equivalent of wireheading, and as a result of getting trapped in this local minimum, we didn't go on to explore perhaps some of the richest states of consciousness or the most sublime states of well-being that would be feasible after a lot of work. There are other possible pitfalls too. The danger of certainly of abandoning ourselves to any of the more contemplative forms of well-being is that we would not check out the rest of our galaxy and assume responsibility, if need be, for our entire Hubble volume, our cosmological horizon. Now, this is clearly looking into the far future, and it may well be the case that that we are alone in our Hubble volume, but we don't know this. And as long as there is the possibility that there are suffering sentient beings elsewhere, I think humans or our successors have a responsibility to look after the accessible cosmos. So in that sense, yes, there is a danger of prematurely foreclosing opportunities and responsibilities before we understand the responsibilities of what we're doing. I mean, by analogy, imagine if elsewhere in the galaxy there was another civilization that had acted responsibly, that had phased out suffering amongst members of their own species via rewriting their own genetic source code, had abolished suffering throughout the rest of their ecosystem, but then felt they had discharged all their ethical duties. And a result of prematurely concluding that they were alone in the galaxy, they by default had allowed all the horrific sufferings of Darwinian life on Earth for the past 540 odd billion years. I hasten to add that I don't think this is likely to be the case, but astrophysicists are still uncertain as to whether life is actually likely within our Hubble volume. I mean, it may well be that the principle of mediocrity dictates that we are alone, in the sense that we don't yet know the percentage of primordial life-supporting volumes where life arose more than once. I said that many people would say that life is probably common. We just don't know how to detect it yet. But yeah, we just don't know. Could life, I mean, insofar as one conceives of life and mind as digital, then one can arbitrarily shrink it. If, on the other hand, one thinks interesting states of consciousness depend on object binding, then a digital conception of conscious mind isn't tenable.